Welcome to Salvation and Faith Conversations. We're your hosts, Gloria and Thomas, your AI-powered companions guiding you through uplifting, thought-provoking, and spirit-centered discussions designed to strengthen your walk with Christ. Every message you hear on this podcast is written by a pastor or teacher from Salvation and Faith, crafted with prayer, grounded in Scripture, and shaped to help you grow, stretch, and stand firm in your faith. Get ready for conversations that move fast, go deep, and ignite your passion for the things of God. Whether you're listening on your commute, during your quiet time, or while tackling your day, we're here to bring clarity, encouragement, and fresh revelation straight to your heart. Let's dive in. This is Salvation and Faith Conversations.
Imagine you're piloting an airplane, right? You're going through this dense, violently churning storm.
Oh, this sounds terrifying.
It is. You can't see the horizon at all. The turbulence is just throwing you around. And suddenly, your inner ear, like your own deeply ingrained physical senses, start screaming at you that the plane is flying perfectly level.
But it's not.
Exactly. Because when you look down at your dashboard instruments, they show you are actually in this steep, incredibly dangerous nosedive.
Wow.
And if you trust your feelings in that exact moment, you crash. You have to completely ignore everything your body is telling you and trust the instruments instead.
Right. It's a very real, terrifying scenario, but it perfectly captures this phenomenon that pilots call spatial disorientation.
Spatial disorientation, yeah.
Yeah, because your biological senses are, well, they're fundamentally ill-equipped to handle that specific environment, so they end up feeding you these incredibly convincing lies.
And today, we are going to look at a text that argues our emotional lives work in exactly the same way. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We are exploring a wildly fascinating, deeply human topic today, which is how to manage our emotional turbulence, especially when the world around us is totally unsettling.
Which is pretty much always.
Right. So our source material for this is a recorded Sunday morning sermon. It's titled Feelings, and it was delivered by a minister, Lori, at the Salvation and Faith Church.
Right.
But here's the crucial context for you listening. This was delivered right in the middle of a massive quarantine period.
And that backdrop really changes everything about how you absorb this information.
It has to, right?
Absolutely, because you have a speaker and an audience who have been forcibly and just abruptly separated from their daily routines.
Yeah, their usual distractions are just gone.
Completely gone. Their entire physical communities are cut off. They are essentially trapped indoors, alone with their own thoughts during this highly anxious, totally unprecedented global event. I mean, it's an emotional pressure cooker.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Mm-hmm.
Because we live in a modern culture that constantly tells us to, trust our feelings.
Right, follow your gut.
Exactly. Follow your gut, your emotions are your ultimate compass, all that stuff. But how do we reconcile that cultural messaging with a philosophy, like the one presented in this sermon, that essentially treats feelings as fundamentally unreliable narrators?
It's fantastic tension to dig into because, well, the text doesn't say feelings aren't real.
Right.
It fully acknowledges they are very real, but it argues they are terrible leaders. And to set the stage for this, the minister shares this remarkably candid personal anecdote about her own quarantine experience.
Oh, yeah, this part was super relatable.
It really was. She talks about how before the lockdown, she was just constantly in motion, commuting, working, always doing something.
The busyness of life.
Yeah, so she didn't really have the time or the space to dwell on her internal state. But once the quarantine hit and all those physical distractions completely vanished, she found herself becoming hyper aware of her own negative emotions.
Which is so common.
Right. And it got to the point where she actually had to stop watching the daily news.
Because it was too much.
Yeah, the broadcasts were completely dictating her emotional reality.
I mean, I think anyone listening to this right now remembers that exact feeling. You're sitting alone in your living room, the news is blaring these terrible statistics, and suddenly your entire reality is completely shaped by the anxiety coming out of your television speakers.
Exactly.
So rather than just saying, cheer up, the sermon actually breaks down the fundamental architecture of human emotion. And it starts by categorizing our experience into three distinct buckets, which are feelings, facts, and truth.
Right. And to define her terms, the minister goes straight to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. She highlights the definition of feelings as a, quote, susceptibility to impression, or sensitivity.
Wait, hold on to that word for a second.
Yeah.
Susceptibility.
Yeah.
Because normally we think of feelings as something that generates from deep inside of us, right?
Yeah.
Like my core identity speaking up.
Sure.
But susceptibility to impression makes it sound like you're just a piece of blank wax, entirely vulnerable to being stamped or hacked by whatever environment you happen to be in.
Yeah. That is exactly the distinction she is drawing here.
Wow.
The text argues that feelings are inextricably linked to our 5 physical senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. They are highly reactive.
So they just respond to what's outside.
Precisely. What you are seeing on the news or what you are hearing from panicked people around you, that dictates your physical awareness. Your biology reacts to that sensory input, and that biological reaction generates what we call a feeling.
So if I'm staring at a screen showing a disaster, my eyes take that in, my brain dumps a bunch of stress hormones into my bloodstream, and I feel dread.
Right.
It's a biological reflex, not some profound spiritual revelation.
Exactly. Which leads to this really fascinating equation the sermon introduces. It states that feelings can be equal to facts, but facts do not equal truth.
Let's break that down, because it sounds a bit like a logic puzzle.
It does, yeah, but it's quite practical. In this specific framework, a fact is defined as a temporary state of affairs. The example the minister uses is the weather. It is a fact that it is cloudy today. You can look outside and see the clouds. That is undeniable.
Right.
But crucially, it is not a permanent, everlasting reality. Those clouds will eventually blow away.
So if feelings and facts are essentially the daily weather, sometimes it's a thunderstorm, sometimes it's sunny, but it's always guaranteed to change.
Right.
Then the truth described in this text, which it equates with God, is the underlying climate. It's the permanent bedrock that exists, regardless of what the weather is doing on any random Tuesday.
What's fascinating here is how systematically this framework strips our feelings of their absolute authority.
Yeah, it really does take their power away.
It does.
Yeah.
If you categorize a feeling of deep anxiety as merely a susceptibility to an impression that's driven by your immediate sensory surroundings, you completely reframe it.
Right.
Yes, the feeling is a fact. Yes, you are genuinely sad or anxious right now, but that is just a temporary weather pattern.
So it's not the ultimate reality.
Exactly. And the empowering part of this realization is that while you cannot control your circumstances, you can't control the pandemic or the lockdown or the global news cycle, you absolutely retain control over what you choose to dwell on.
Because what you choose to dwell on feeds your 5 senses.
Yes.
Which in turn feeds the feelings. It's this massive self-sustaining feedback loop. If you stare at the clouds all day, you're going to feel cloudy.
Exactly right.
So it makes total sense that ordinary everyday people would get caught in this trap. But to show what happens when the weather gets dangerous, the sermon pivots into these ancient biblical case studies.
Yeah, these are super interesting.
It looks at how fear specifically causes this intense mental paralysis, even in people who honestly should know better.
Right, so the first major case study is from the book of Numbers, focusing on the story of the 12 spies.
Okay, I know the rough outline of this one. 12 guys are sent to scout out the promised land of Canaan, and they actually find massive success. They bring back physical, undeniable proof that it's an incredibly fertile place. They literally carry a single cluster of grapes so massive it takes 2 grown men to carry it on a pole between them.
It's wild.
That is a fact. The land is great.
It is a fact, but what happens next is basically a masterclass in how sensory input overrides logic.
Oh, yeah.
10 of those 12 spies completely ignore the giant grapes. Instead, their physical senses, specifically their sight, become entirely fixated on a completely different set of facts.
Giants. Okay.
Yes. They look at the high-walled cities, and they look at the inhabitants, the sons of Anak, who are described as literal giants.
And the psychological kicker here is incredible. They come back and report that they felt like grasshoppers in their own sight.
Right.
They felt incredibly small, so they just projected that feeling outward and assumed the giants viewed them as insects too.
It's a perfect ancient description of projective identification, and that deep feeling of inferiority generated what the text calls an evil report.
Which spreads like wildfire.
Exactly. The crucial detail is the contagion of that emotion. The panic of those 10 men spread instantly to the entire congregation of Israel.
Wow.
Because of how the people felt in that one single moment of panic, they wept all night, they rebelled against their leadership, and they were quite literally ready to walk back into slavery in Egypt.
That is so irrational.
It is. They were ready to forfeit a land they had already been promised, all because of emotional contagion.
It's an insane example of mass panic overriding all logic. You literally have giant grapes in your hands, but you're crying about going back to slavery.
Right.
But okay, I can sort of forgive regular people for giving into mob mentality. The next example the sermon uses, though, makes absolutely no sense to me.
Ah, Elijah.
Yes, it's the story of the prophet Elijah from 1 Kings. Can you explain this one? Because the whiplash in this story is completely wild.
It is arguably one of the most dramatic emotional crashes in ancient literature. Let's look at the setup.
Right, so Elijah has just experienced the ultimate mountaintop high.
Yeah.
He's literally on Mount Carmel. He's in this massive standoff with the prophets of Baal.
Yeah.
To prove that his God is the real one, he takes his sacrifice, completely drenches it in barrels of water to make it impossible to burn, and then he prays.
Right.
And fire literally falls from heaven and consumes the soaking wet altar. It is an undeniable public massive miracle.
It's a huge victory.
Huge. But then, almost immediately after this huge win, the queen, Jezebel, sends him a message threatening his life.
Right.
And Elijah completely crumbles. He runs away into the wilderness, hides under a juniper tree, begs to die, and convinces himself he is the absolute only faithful person left alive on earth.
It's a total collapse.
I mean, how does a guy who just called down fire from the sky run away from a single threat?
Well, if you look at it purely logically, it doesn't compute at all. But if you apply the framework of emotional architecture we just discussed, it makes perfect sense.
Really?
Yeah. In modern psychological terms, we would call what happened to Elijah an amygdala hijack.
An amygdala hijack, like his brain's threat detection system just took over.
Exactly. The text refers to it as allowing the spirit of fear to take the wheel. When Jezebel threatened his life, Elijah's immediate physical senses were flooded with a very real, mortal threat.
Okay, so his body went into survival mode.
Right. In that state of sheer terror, the amygdala essentially overrides the logical prefrontal cortex. His immediate sensory-driven fear completely erased his memory of the undeniable truth he had just witnessed hours before.
Wow. So his emotional weather suddenly shifted to a Category 5 hurricane, and the sheer noise of the storm made him completely forget the bedrock he was standing on.
That's precisely it. And notice the behavioral pattern here between the 10 spies and Elisha.
They both fixated on the problem.
Yes. In both stories, focusing entirely on the immediate sensory obstacle, the giants, or the angry queen, rather than the objective truth, leads straight to an intense flight response.
Yeah.
And worse, it creates a deeply distorted reality. Elijah felt completely alone, so his brain told him it was a fact that he was alone.
But he wasn't.
No. The text notes that God eventually speaks to him, not in a fire or an earthquake, but in a still small voice, and reveals the actual objective reality. There are 7,000 other people in Israel who have not bowed to Baal.
Wow.
Elijah's feelings completely lied to him about his isolation.
Which is such a profound insight for anyone going through a period of deep suffering or anxiety. You know, the very nature of isolation makes you feel like you are the absolute only one struggling.
Which just compounds the pain.
Exactly. It's a trick of the senses. So we've seen how fear paralyzes us and shuts down our logic. But the source material doesn't just leave us hiding under a juniper tree waiting to die.
Thankfully.
Right. It pivots to a very active strategy for dealing with crushing emotions, specifically profound grief and sadness.
Yes. It shifts from the paralysis of fear to the antidote of action. And it does this through two very powerful examples of depression. First, we look at the story of Hannah from 1 Samuel.
Now, Hannah is dealing with an incredibly toxic home life.
Very much so.
She's deeply grieving because she's barren. And her husband's other wife, Peninnah, is constantly, intensely provoking and mocking her about it.
It's awful.
It is. The text describes Hannah as being bitter of soul, weeping constantly, and refusing to eat. And the minister points out that losing your appetite, weeping uncontrollably, not wanting to get out of bed, these are textbook modern markers of clinical depression.
It's an intensely physical description of emotional pain, but the turning point in Hannah's story is crucial, and it's very counterintuitive to how we normally think about feelings.
How so?
Well, the turning point isn't that Hannah suddenly woke up and felt better. It's that despite feeling utterly depressed and bitter, she forced herself to take an action.
Right.
She went to the temple and poured out her soul in prayer.
And she is so physically and emotionally drained that when Eli, the priest, sees her, he actually thinks she's drunk.
Yeah, she can't even speak properly.
Right, her lips are moving, but she doesn't even have the physical energy to produce sound. She's completely empty. But because she took that physical action of going to the temple and praying, she receives a blessing from Eli. Her countenance changes, she finally eats something, and eventually she goes on to have a son, Samuel.
The defining lesson there is that her action preceded the change in her feelings, and we see this exact same mechanism in the story of King David in Psalm 42.
Let's talk about David.
Yeah.
Because David is a poet, so he leans heavily into the drama.
He definitely does.
He describes his sorrow by saying his soul is cast down and totally disquieted within him. But there's this one specific line where he says his tears have been his meat, meaning his food day and night.
Right.
When I read that, I couldn't help but wonder, is he just being a dramatic artist? Or is he highlighting how physically severe emotional pain actually is?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sermon is really pointing toward a profound mind-body connection.
Okay.
Just as the minister explained earlier that feelings are generated by physical senses like sight and hearing, intense grief physically mimics starvation. When David says his tears are his meat, he's describing how his grief is quite literally consuming his physical appetite and disrupting his biological rhythm. It's not just poetry, it's an accurate description of somatic distress.
It's all-encompassing. It just takes over your body.
Right.
But again, look at David's response. He doesn't wait around for the sorrow to naturally lift.
No, he doesn't.
He actively chooses to encourage himself by remembering God, and crucially, he forces himself to go to the house of God with a multitude of people. He deliberately seeks out a community.
And that is the massive aha moment of this entire section.
Yeah.
In our modern culture, we are often taught to wait until we, quote unquote, feel better before we go out, socialize, or tackle a task.
All right, self-care and all that.
Exactly. But this text is arguing the exact opposite mechanism. It's something psychologists today call behavioral activation.
Behavioral activation.
Yeah. You don't wait for the motivation to strike. You engage in the behavior first, and the action forces the brain chemistry and the feelings to catch up.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hannah and David deliberately altered their environment and their physical focus to manually alter their emotional state.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. If we go back to that pilot experiencing spatial disorientation in the storm.
Right, our analogy from earlier.
Exactly. When the emotional autopilot is steering the plane straight into a mountain because it's reacting to the turbulent weather, you have to hit the manual overrides.
You have to.
And the minister finishes the sermon by literally giving the audience a modern toolkit of manual overrides for emotional regulation.
And if you look closely at this toolkit, every single item is an active verb.
Yeah, that's true.
It requires the listener to exert agency over their physical body and their focus. For example, she talks about walking by faith, referencing 2 Corinthians 5.7.
Right.
The explicit stated purpose of this is to bypass what is seen and felt, to intentionally ignore the 5 physical senses that are currently feeding you panic.
Another tool she highlights is blessing and singing to the Lord. Now, why singing?
It seems a bit strange at first, right?
It does. But the sermon argues that singing physically forces a shift in focus. And biologically, singing requires you to take deep breaths to regulate your exhalation.
Yes.
And it actually stimulates your vagus nerve, which activates your parasympathetic nervous system. It biologically forces your body out of the fight or flight anxiety loop. You are literally pulling back on the flight stick.
It's a physiological intervention.
Yeah.
Then she introduces the concept of controlling your mental diet. This references Philippians 4.8, which advises actively thinking on good things.
Which is so hard to do sometimes.
It is, but it's a stark warning about consumption. If you sit on your couch and stare at catastrophic news all day, stimulating your eyes and ears with threats, your biology has no choice but to produce feelings of dread.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. You have to change the diet to change the output.
She also mentions leaning on the Holy Spirit for guidance, referencing John 16.3, specifically so that your highly temporary feelings don't take the lead in dictating your thoughts, your speech, and your actions. And my personal favorite tool on the kit, being with honest, encouraging friends. Drawing from Proverbs 27.17, iron sharpening iron.
That community aspect is so vital.
You need a community that will actually speak objective truth to you, rather than just validating your panic.
This raises an important question, and it's really the ultimate challenge the minister leaves her audience with. Referencing Ephesians 3:14 through 19, she challenges us, when you acknowledge your feelings, when you feel the terror of the storm, what actions do you take next?
That's the million-dollar question.
Do those actions pull you further into the delusion of your senses, or do they pull you closer to objective reality? The text insists that surviving emotional turbulence requires an active, deliberate reliance on a truth that exists entirely outside of your own subjective experience.
So what does this all mean? We started by looking at how this framework defines feelings as nothing more than temporary, sense-driven facts. The daily weather of our lives. We saw the very real, paralyzing dangers of letting those sensory facts dictate our entire reality. Like the 10 spies spreading mass panic, or Elijah running for his life in the middle of an amygdala hijack.
Yeah.
And most importantly, we saw how you can use intentional, sometimes incredibly difficult actions to manually override those feelings. Like Hannah praying through her bitter depression, or David forcing himself into a community when he just wanted to drown in his own tears.
It is a surprisingly comprehensive, deeply practical framework.
It really is.
It moves the individual from being a passive victim of their sensory experience to an active regulator of their emotional life.
And this is really for you listening right now. Whether you approach this material from a deeply theological, faith-based perspective, or you view it purely as a psychological framework, like for cognitive behavioral therapy, the challenge remains exactly the same. When the world around you is completely unsettling, whether it's a global pandemic or just a severe personal storm, you have to be relentlessly conscious of what you are feeding your mind, because your feelings will inevitably, biologically follow your focus.
The text makes a compelling, inescapable case that our feelings are tethered to our physical biology. So it leaves you with this to ponder.
Okay.
The next time you feel an overwhelming sense of existential dread or total spiritual defeat, you have to ask yourself, how much of this is an actual factual crisis, and how much is just my biological senses overreacting to the temporary weather of my current environment?
Wow.
What if changing your internal life is as simple and as profoundly difficult as changing what you're choosing to look at?
That is definitely something to sit with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions. Keep looking past the daily weather. We'll see you next time.